for opening statements, for opening questions. Mr. Koenig, you mentioned the presence of China and Chinese-controlled ports on both sides of the Panama Canal. How does that pose a threat to the United States?
Well, I think it poses a number of challenges. One, to the topic we just discussed, China is shipping fentanyl precursors through the Panama Canal. Second, by operating the ports there, including with surveillance technology, Chinese surveillance technology, they're using that to collect information that's going back to Beijing. May not be classified information, but it's sensitive that China could use to exploit for an intelligence advantage. China could seek to hinder trade through the canal, which would have negative economic consequences for America's well-being. And then
how could they do that? How could they hinder trade? How can they stop it? I mean, the port operators on both sides, do they determine who goes first, who goes second, et cetera, or how does that work in the Panama Canal?
Yes. Well, in terms of the specific operations, some of my colleagues may be better able to speak to that, but halting, disrupting trade in a place like that would not be very difficult. I think we've seen in other cases where ships get stuck in, say, the Suez Canal, global trade really takes a hit. And so I think there are a number of things they could do to hinder trade, such as putting a ship in the canal and not letting other ships go through. And so there's the economic dimension, and then there's the military dimension in the event of a crisis or war, hindering U.S. naval vessels that could make it more difficult for the United States to project military power where it needs to go.
Fair enough. Dr. Berg, in terms of the presence of China, the ever-increasing presence of China in infrastructure, especially in ports, my first question is, where were we? Because when I visited Peru, and I know they have a huge port they just constructed in Peru, they're actually putting out an RFP for the second port down in South Peru, and they want us to participate. They really want us to participate. Where has the United States been for the last, I guess, 2 to 3 decades down in South America?
Chairman, I agree wholeheartedly with your concern. I think we were looking in other theaters of the world, and we had forgotten, frankly, that security, prosperity, economic integration, the ability to deter illegal immigration, and so on, it starts right here at home and in our own hemisphere. So I welcome this administration's focus on the Western Hemisphere, what seems to me a very intense focus on the Western Hemisphere. I think it's proper, and it's about time we spend more time looking into not just our security, but also our commercial diplomacy in this hemisphere. The problem, Mr. Chairman, is that we're playing from behind now because we've focused on other theaters of the world for 40 or so years at least. Especially with ports, Mr. Chairman, it's far easier to play offense than it is to play defense, to get the U.S. private sector interested, for example, in the port you've just discussed in Peru, than it is to try to get the Peruvians to wiggle out of this new megaport, for example, at Chancay.
Yeah, look, one of the things that I found when I was down in South America is that we were more interested in ideological diplomacy than in commercial diplomacy, okay? Focus on stuff that really did not advance American interests at all. Dr. Cardin, when you talk about military use of these facilities and you haven't seen much, maybe my premise is that they're going to build all the infrastructure and then they're going to appear, because if they start to appear now, then it kind of shakes us and wakes us up. But they are building that infrastructure, right? The ability to somehow then project power into our own hemisphere. They have the largest Navy in the world right now. They're building more and more ships, completely outpacing the United States in terms of their ship production. Their large Blue Navy ship production completely outpaces us here in the United States. And so, is there a threat to that? They're building the facilities. Will one day, all of a sudden, we'll see a bunch of People's Liberation Army Navy in our own hemisphere, in our own backyards?
Chairman Giménez, you're absolutely correct that pretty much any commercial port is intrinsically dual use, particularly the modern facilities that Chinese firms are constructing, owning, and operating in the hemisphere. But as you also note, there's been relatively minimal PLA operational activity in this hemisphere. And while I agree that it's possible for them to do it on relatively short notice, sailing across the Pacific. I think from a strategic standpoint, it's unlikely that Beijing chooses to make this hemisphere the area where they're trying to match up militarily against the United States in at least the near term. And the main reason for that is their overwhelming strategic focus remains in the Western Pacific, of course, Taiwan contingencies, but also the South China Sea and East China Sea. So while I think it's a reasonable concern and one that ought to be monitored, I think it's somewhat unlikely that they attempt to project large amounts of power into this hemisphere.
I agree with you on short term. My time is up, and I'll just make one final statement, is that the Chinese have a very long-range point of view, and that they look at things 100 years ahead, not like us, we look at things 2 years ahead. And so with that, I will